But let me introduce our speaker today, my good friend, and many of you's good friend, Quincy Brown. Quincy grew up in Gainesville. Most of you know that, and he is certainly one of ours. I think it was 1995. Quincy can tell me if I'm
That's right
or wrong. That he came to Gainesville as a very young associate in charge of outreach, I believe, at our church, and as director of Gainesville Action Ministries. And that was a tremendous responsibility for somebody as young as Quincy was, but he answered the call. He worked hard for Gainesville Action Ministries, which was a fledgling organization at that time over in the basement of St. Paul Church, and worked very hard at Gainesville First. He got more responsibility than he intended there when we had a pastoral change mid-year. But he rose to that occasion as well. And we love Quincy, and he went from us to LaGrange and served as chaplain at LaGrange College for a number of years. I know Mike referenced last week in his program that his son, I think, was there and worked with Quincy at LaGrange, and he served many, many other churches in the conference. I'm going to share with you what he sent me. I said, Quincy, tell me a little bit about how best to introduce you. And this is what he's doing now. Quincy is the district superintendent and missional strategist of the Central South District. And that includes DeKalb County, Rockdale County, Newton County, and Henry County. And this past year, the cabinet changed the names of the districts. And so we used to be the Gainesville district, and now we're the maybe Northeast district or something like that. Anyway, and it covers more counties. So it's always been a big job, but it's even a bigger job right now. He is a certified transitional guide and church transformation coach with over 25 years of ministry. Quincy is passionate about equipping churches to imagine new ways to connect people with Jesus. Quincy's married to Dion Moore Brown. She's a CPA and income tax manager. And he is also an author. Quincy's written several books, and his latest is called Discipleship Path, Guiding Congregations to Connect with Jesus. Quincy has certainly done a lot of connections for all of us over the years. We are thrilled to have him with us this morning. We only wish it could be in person, but we have the next best thing. So Quincy, take us down the road to Jericho, and we thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Sally, and good morning, class. It is good to finally see you. I think when Sally initially had this conversation, I'm trying to share my screen, so I'm not trying to give you vertigo. Hang on, we'll get there. Let's see here. There we go. Can everybody see that? All right. And it's been a while since Sally first initiated the invitation, and so I've been looking forward to this. And let me just say, this is more of a treat to me than it will be for you, because if it were not for Gainesville First, I would not be who I am today. You all graciously took a very young, naive, inexperienced person and put him in a context that set him up for the trajectory that I'm on today. And so I am eternally grateful for you all putting up with some of my faux pas, my shortcomings and mistakes. It was a blast. I think about you all often, and I'm pleased to be able to do this. This is a conversation, and so at some point, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and kind of ask questions and have comments along the way. I don't want this to be one-sided. And so it's called Journey to Jericho, Race, Conversation, Discovery, and Transformation. And this is a project that I've been working on since the summer. As many of you have watched some of the ongoing struggles in the national news, particularly in the summer, I struggled with what was happening and tried to find a fateful way to discuss it with people. And so I pulled together a group of folks in July, a group of about 9 people. And it was only supposed to be a 2-week conversation. And I developed this Journey to Jericho concept. That 2-week conversation is still going on now. And so, and it's a different approach, an alternative approach to race. I talk about race as a cultural phenomenon instead of calling people racist or talking about racism. And here's why. In my experience, when those terms come about, you can expect different reactions from different sets of people. And I'm just going to be very colloquial here. For white folk, the last thing that they want, in my experience, the last thing they want to be told is they're racist. Okay, that's been my experience. And with black folk, the last thing they want to be told is they're a sellout. And so, what tends to happen is when we focus on racism and racist as that topic, we begin to hear things like white privilege and implicit bias. And while all those things are beneficial, they still don't get to the core of the issue. And so what I want to talk about is looking at the story of Journey of Jericho, and all of you know the story of the Samaritan. The word "good" is something that's actually added afterwards, and and there are many ways to interpret this story. I'm looking at the story through the lens that Jesus is actually interrupting a cultural norm. And we'll talk about that as we go through. And so let me see if I can get this thing to work. So here's the overview of what we're going to do. It's a 2-part process. And again, this is a new way of thinking. And so I don't expect you to get this overnight. I'm happy once this is over, I'll share this. You can certainly use it, tweak it in any way you want to, because it's not an expert opinion. It's just from my experience and working with others. So this is a model of discovery that digs deeper into the cultural realities of race. The focus isn't on race or racism, being racist or racism, as I mentioned. It's not based on personal opinions, but the deeper culture world of SALT, church, and society. It will prompt a fresh approach to understanding how deeply held assumptions about race in America influences congregations. It is the deep energy, that's a sophisticated term that I learned over the years, the deep energy of any organization, congregation, nonprofit, corporations, committees, etc., that rest below the level of conscious awareness, below the surface of obvious objects, slogans, and practices. And it works from the premise that we must approach things differently in order to recognize more of what's going on. So that's kind of an overview of, let's see here, there we go. Sometimes it's difficult to get this thing to work. And so there are 3 levels of culture. And so I'm talking about culture as a phenomenon. Many of you have your own interpretations of culture, certainly about region and nationality and race and all of those things. All of those are included. I'm talking about a larger umbrella of culture. And this was taught to me by my mentor and coach, George Thompson, who studied under the tutelage of Edgar Schein. Edgar Schein is a former professor of the Sloan School of Business at MIT, and he use this for organization, and my mentor and coach interpreted this for congregations. And so he's taught me this, and he's given me permission to use it and to adapt it from my perspective. And so I'm going to talk about 3 levels of culture. And I want to talk about it in very sophisticated terms. So the first level of culture is the stuff we see and feel. That's my sophisticated term. That's the first thing you see, right? It's the observable behavior, data, and artifacts. And so if you walk into a church, let's just use church because that's my expertise. If you walk into a church, you look and see, are there pews or are there chairs? Are there screens or are there not? Are there drum sets or are there screens or is there pipe organs and pianos? Okay, that's the stuff you see. You have no idea what it means. And let me just suggest that it's hard to decipher. It may not be what you think. Okay, so you can walk into a place and, oh, I've seen this before. Well, you may have seen it before, but it may not actually be what you think. And so, as Sally said, I grew up in Gainesville. I'm a native of Gainesville. And one of the things I learned in the 4th grade, my 1st grade teacher was one of your former members. She's now gone on to glory, Miss Hemphill. I don't know if any of you all remember that name, but she was my 1st grade teacher. But when I was in the 4th grade, my teacher wrote on the board the word assume. And because I was a 4th grade boy, I've never seen the word assume put on the board. And I began laughing. And all of my friends began laughing. Because if you put a slash between the last S and the first M and the word assume, it's something that a 4th grader boy would get tickles at. And so there's a 4th grade boy still inside of me. And so I try not to assume anything, okay? And so when I see something, I try not to assume I know what it means. So anything that's observable, the facts of the object structure, all kind, persons, relationships, etc. You have no idea what it means. And so I just kind of categorize and say, okay, well, if it's in a church, it has this. In terms of our topic of race, I'll give you a experience that happened yesterday. Again, these are my personal experiences, and this is how this framework works. I was taking my wife and my mother-in-law to get something dinner. My mother-in-law is 82 years old, and she's got a touch of dementia, and so she's a retired nurse. And she is the extrovert of all extroverts. She has to be the center of attention. And so she'll say, I'm bored. Son, I'm bored. And so that basically is code for me to take her and ride her around somewhere. Okay. Well, I didn't have but a 4th tank of gas. And so I needed to get gas yesterday. So I go to the gas station and I'm pumping my gas. And out of the corner of my eye, SUV pulls up. A guy gets out. He has a Dallas Cowboy skull cap on, and you know I can make some associations there, right? But I chose not to. Okay. But as he leaned over to pump his gas, I noticed that there was something protruding from his waist. I zeroed in a little closer. It was a gun. And so here's how the stuff we see makes an assumption. I assumed, okay, this guy's carrying a gun. Well, he must be afraid. That was my assumption. Okay. I don't know if it was right or not, but again, it happened instantaneously. And so I had to pull myself back because I had made an assumption based upon what I saw as if I knew what it was. That's a small example, but does that make sense? Not if that makes sense or that way. All right, so that's the stuff we see. That's the very surface. So the next thing is the sayings we hear and speak. Okay, these are the espoused and most of the time aspirational values. These are the explicitly written or spoken values of a congregation or organization. Many of the ideologies or rationalizations may not be consistent with the stuff we see and feel. So an example is any, and if this is church examples, okay? So any use of a scripture, slogan, creed, pledges, or mission statements used to express something that the group values. So one of the churches that I served, when you walk into the church, you walk into a large lobby. And then when you walk into the worship center, over the door of the worship center is an emblazed scripture of go and make disciples. And it has the Matthew 28. Okay. That is a primary example of sayings that you hear and speak. That's one of those. It could be either stuff you see or the sayings that you hear and speak, because everybody talked about it, and so that became an espoused value. However, when it came to actually doing what the text says, well, that was a different story. Okay. Now, here's the crux of everything. So, we talked about the sayings and the stuff, what you see and what you hear. And if there's a disconnect between what people say and what people do, there is a good chance that there's a submerged belief going on. Submerged belief, that should say that drives behavior instead of assumptions. That should say drive behavior. These are the rarely conscious, taken for granted, deeply held assumptions about the way things are. Now, at one time, they represented a group saying or collective values, but by consensus, they're taken for granted and dropped out of everyday awareness. Now, this is where the looking at race through the lens of culture begins to show up. I'm giving examples of national submerged beliefs. One is the narrative of racial separation or difference. What drives that is hierarchy, okay? And what supports that are three different type of submerged belief. Individualism, seeing the world through individual lenses, that believes people are autonomous and can make decisions independent of systems and structures. Rationalism, anything that's wrong with the world can be fixed by reconciling individual relationships together. Anti-structuralism, focusing too much on systems and structures diminishes individual responsibility. So we've covered more ground here in only 4 slides. And so I'd like to stop now and ask you to unmute yourself to ask for any questions of clarifications or comments, because this will begin to be the framework in which we begin to talk about how we can analyze and deal with race.
Quincy, in the examples that you give, individualism, relationalism, and is one of those more prevalent or more dangerous or more where we are than the others?
They all feed into each other. So let me give you an example. Okay. Again, these are my personal experiences. Okay. I taught a Sunday school class last Sunday, and we were talking about faith inside the church walls and outside the church walls. Okay. That was the conversation. And so I opened the floor up to questions. And one gentleman question was this. I kind of knew it was coming, but I didn't know it was coming so early. First question. Do you believe do you believe that there's systemic racism? And so here I am with a group of 75 people on a Zoom call. and that's the first question I'm asked, not about anything else. Okay. And so I'm going through my mind very quickly these three things. And I'm curious about where he is and what is motivating that question. Okay. And so if you are an individual, everything is about individuals and it's independent of systems and structure. Okay. And so if we talk about the narrative of racial difference and there's a hierarchy, the implicit hierarchy basis is that number one, the default in this country is white, and anything other than white is not the norm. Now, that's the experience of persons who are part of the non-dominant culture. Okay. And so if you're from the dominant culture and you buy into this individualism and anti-structuralism, which means focusing too much on the systems and structure diminishes individual responsibility. Okay. And so where we are today, one using this could begin to wonder, well, is this what we're bumping into? Does that make sense? Because if you are an individual and you don't buy too much into structures and systems, if that is your default unconscious submerged belief that is part of the culture and the air that you live and to breathe, then to say that racism is institutional goes against that. Doesn't make it right or wrong, but does that make sense?
Yeah.
Other questions, insights, comments?
Yes, this is Johnny Darden. I'll make a comment. We all have our own stories, from how we came up, how we got to where we are, and all the things that happened along the way. And I have thought a lot about this in the last few years. I think it is legitimate. I think there is the institutional racism is, and I don't think it's intended. I think if you hadn't thought about it, you just pass it off and say, well, that's what somebody else just wants to put before us and change the way we do things. Mm-hmm. But I think we did not intend to be put in a situation where we are accused of being racist. Mm-hmm. But when we look at our lives for the past 60 years, mm-hmm. through the time when we all went to school and came through, and look at our circumstances, mm-hmm. and then look at our Black neighbors' circumstances, mm-hmm. Something is wrong there. Mm-hmm. And we as individuals have not intended to be discriminatory. Mm-hmm. We are a product of where we came from.
Right.
Our parents came through the same way. Mm-hmm. They were a product of where they came from. Mm-hmm. And they, as individuals, didn't intend to have a different society, sure. from their Black neighbors, but sure. that's what they were brought into. So I don't want to talk too long, but I think, there's something here that needs to be admitted, but also we don't need to be accused individually necessarily.
Right. And you're right, Johnny. That's the point of this. The point of this is not to make it personal. Okay. The point of this is not to point fingers, but the point of this is to talk about what you talked about. The assumptions that have been inbred. It's like the water that the fish swim in and the air that we breathe. Um, if our culture is about individuals, okay, there's nothing wrong with that. But under the notion of racial difference, then what tends to happen is we don't look at things that we have in common.
Right.
Okay. We typically will look at the difference. Okay. I'll give you an example. When I came to Gainesville, I had no idea that I was going to Gainesville. Okay. It was just a surprise to me as it was to you. And I remember Charles Wilson was the district superintendent at the time. Some of you all might remember Charles with this iPod and red light stop signal. And and I'm not sure who the editor was at the time. Was it Johnny Vardaman? Was he still the editor? Was he the editor at the Times at that time? All right. So they called me and wanted to do an interview for the paper. Okay? And I'm thinking, I just got this position. What am I interviewing for? I have no idea what I'm walking into, right? I just figured this is what the bishop said I was going. And like a good Methodist, I'll go where I'm sent. And so I wasn't available for the interview. So they did the article without me. Okay. And so here's what happened. The headlines, and I wish I had it here, it's in my office. I framed it. Gainesville Church appoints its first Black pastor. Okay. That was the headline. And I'm thinking to myself, that's interesting. Why is that the story? Okay. And then Charles says, this is what we call cross-racial appointments. And friends, let me tell you, that's the first time I've ever heard that word. No, nobody asked me, okay? I would have thought that they'd come to the horse's mouth to ask. And so from that day forward, guess what mantle I was branded with? I was branded with being one of the first cross-racial appointments in North Georgia. Okay. And I'm like, I didn't ask for this. Okay. And so again, the question becomes, why was it a big thing as an article? Number two, why was it framed in terms of race? That was my first entry as a 25-year-old into, oh, there's something going on here. I didn't quite know what it was. I didn't have the words to speak about it. But here I was being appointed as a minister of the church, and I figured, well, if they appointed me, they must want me here. And I felt like, well, I'm going to do the best I can and work as hard as I've ever worked. And so it turned out all right for me. I hope it turned out all right for you all. But the notion that when I walked into the door, I was already the Black minister. Why is that?
To me, in my thinking, I'm learning more about how we put everything in terms of dualistic thinking.
Sure.
You know, thinking is either right or wrong, and it's racist or not racist. And so if you just put things in terms of dualism, that's where you get cut off every time. And so we've got to think about a bigger spread of alternatives. And you did exactly the right thing to just say, I'm going to do the best I can in these circumstances.
That's right.
That was the best thing. not to put things in terms of this or that,
Right.
right or wrong.
Right. And let me just be clear. Thanks for that. Let me be clear. I did get questions about, you know, early on. None of you asked me this question, but I got questions from people in the congregation. When are you going to really preach to us? And I said, well, what do you mean by that? He says, well, when are you going to preach like you preach at the black church? And I said, well, I'll do that once you begin to invite your friends to church. And the conversation stopped. Okay. And so all of a sudden, you know, the assumption was because I was the black minister at Gainesville First, that black people were going to come. And I kept saying, no, they're not going to come because of that. Okay. But again, that's just a small example of even the best intentions get thwarted by these submerged beliefs. That's my point here. Okay. We all have them.
Quincy, does the media or the press at the time that you live have anything to do with this? When I was a boy, the Uncle Remus stories were beloved. And
Sure.
Uncle Remus was a beloved character.
Sure.
Now, if you read those stories, it's blatant racism. But it
Sure.
was unintentional racism when Joel Cheryl Hines wrote those. But it has evolved. And a lot of this evolution is from what I read, and
Yeah.
I don't know why it's evolved that way.
So yes, I would argue that it is the media. I would argue that it is kind of the shifting of the culture. I would also ask the question, and here again, these are my personal experiences. Because I'm a product of Gainesville, Georgia. Okay, there were cultural assumptions that had little to do with race, but had to do with social standings in Gainesville as well. Okay. As a kid, and I'm not trying to ruffle feathers, I'm just gonna call it what it was. I was born into the city. I was born in Newtown. Some of you all know where Newtown is. That's where my grandparents on both sides, that's where they lived. In fact, if you all remember, the AME church, where someone tried to had this plan to go in and kill folks a couple of last summer or whenever it was. Y'all remember that? Well, the house next to that church is my grandmother's house. Was my grandmother's house. When she died, she left it to my dad, and my dad sold it. Worst thing he ever done. But that's another story for another day. And so we moved from Newtown to in our culture, it was called out the road, south of the city, south of the tracks. And so that meant I had to change schools. And so I was not a product of Gainesville High School. I went to East Hall. And so there was this rivalry between East Hall and Gainesville. Okay. And if you were a black kid from East Hall, you were not thought of as highly as you were from Gainesville. I learned about Gainesville first years before I went there, because I remember when the church was on the square, right off the square off of Green Street. And well, I don't know if that was Green Street. What was that road that ran in front of the church?
Green Street.
Spring Street. Was it Spring Street and Green?
Spring.
Anyway, it's been a while. But the way I got introduced to the preacher of the church is the parsonage, the old parsonage you all had, was across the street from the Whitworths. Some of you might know that name. One of the doctors in town. My mother was the maid there. And so I grew up going with my mom to work before I went to preschool. And one of the children was there. And what I noticed as a child, I didn't understand it, but he could call my mother by her first name, but I had to call his mother Mrs. And so I suggest that story to say it depends on whose perspective whether or not the story is beloved. Okay. If you know the story of that story, if you're part of the dominant culture, that's one thing. But what happens if you're part of the non-dominant culture? It's just a question.
Quincy, this is Ellen Ewing. I grew up in the Mississippi Delta in a little town of 1,400. Mississippi Delta is sometimes called the most southern place on earth.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the minority, but according to population, but I was in the majority in terms of the way that I was able to live.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, we are kind of dancing around this thing that's really very real. I actually have an ancestor who wrote a book about several hundred pages. He was a Methodist minister, by the way, trying to defend slavery in 1840. I want you to know that that book is still in existence. You can order it, and I did, and I read it. And things have not changed in people's minds all that much. Um, I want to tell you about one experience that I had. I think we have to be intentional in not making these assumptions, and let's just call it what it is, and not being racist. I was about 3 years ago, it was Christmas time, and I was getting out of my car and going into Kroger, where I saw this young black man shaking the kettle. All right. My first thought was, what's he doing shaking the kettle? I've never seen a young black man shaking the kettle in front of Kroger. He had dreadlocks. He was exactly the kind of young black man who, if I saw him on a dark night on a dark street, I would probably assume I should be afraid.
Mm-hmm.
So I made up my mind. I walked by him at first. I put some money in. And then I went back to him and I said, listen, I just want to tell you that not every white woman who sees you is afraid or should be afraid.
Mm-hmm.
And I walked on in the store and he looked really amazed. The next day, he was still out there. I went back and I put some money in, went in the store. When I came back out, he said, ma'am, would you come over here just a minute? And I did. And he said, I just want you to know that what you said to me made me think about it all yesterday afternoon. Now, I guess it was a bit of I won't say a lie, but a fib or whatever to say all white women are not afraid of you because of the way that you look. But I think that, you know, let's put it out there. They are. And we have to be intentional about not being and making ourselves vulnerable to situations where we are not comfortable because of the way that we have grown up.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. That's helpful. You know, the notion of vulnerability is one that we're not comfortable with. Let's just call it what it is. We don't like to expose ourselves and our weakness. The other thing that you mentioned that I think is important for us is um, you had a conversation. Um, One of the things that I'm very aware of is we we don't talk to one another anymore. We do more telling than we do asking. And I wonder what would happen if we form relationships that we're intentional about forming relationships that we otherwise wouldn't seek out. Um, you know, most of us are averse to being vulnerable. And when we're vulnerable, what tends to happen in my experience when I'm vulnerable, I tend to, you know, I don't want, I don't want to feel unsafe. And, the fact of the matter is there's some places where I do feel unsafe, um, you know, and it has little to do with the person. It has more to do with my own submerged beliefs that are operative that control my behavior. Okay. And so, uh, what the thing that, again, the submerged beliefs are what control the behavior. And so, if we want to talk about the issue of race, we have to get at what's driving our behavior. And most of the time, we don't know what is driving our behavior. And I would argue that if we begin to take a deep dive, we will find that we've got a lot of things in common, more things in common than we have difference. Um, that's been my experience everywhere I've gone. And so my strategy is always, let's find something in common to talk about. Okay. Uh, and sometimes it's hard work, right? Sometimes, when I was in LaGrange, it was very difficult for me to have something common and talk about, because all those folks in LaGrange were all Auburn fans, and so I'm a diehard Georgia fan. You can't grow up in Gainesville and not be a Georgia fan, and so it was difficult. And so we found something in common. You know what it was? Cheering against Alabama. And that's how we would say it. And my apologies for any Roll Tide fans. Okay, you won the national championship.
Quincy, hi, it's Ron Stowe. I'm so appreciative of the Cross Ties class for providing opportunities like this to talk about this. But, you've really got to realize there is a problem and want to reach out and participate in discussions like this. Yeah. And I was interested that you said you were born in Newtown. I participated in a Zoom meeting a week or so ago when Rose Johnson told the history of Newtown. Uh-huh. I've been in Gainesville since 1978. I had never heard of Newtown. I never heard of the Newtown Forest Club. Uh-huh. And I sat there and was totally enthralled with her story. Yeah. And I thought, how in the world could I have been here since 1978 and not been aware of that? I actually went back and looked up some of the archives in the Gainesville Times and read some of the stories that were published, most of them in the last 20 years or so. But, it amazes me at how I could have been so, I don't know if you call it uninformed or what, but it's, and maybe that's part of the problem too. And, of course, the media, somebody mentioned the media, a lot of this has really come to the forefront the last year or so, that maybe was under the surface and wasn't out there, all during the, time I was talking about. But I'm really enjoying this today.
Yeah, well, good. Well, there are a lot of folk that have Newtown roots, and it's, for those of you that are not aware of the history of Newtown, after it originated after the Great Tornado. There were two that hit, and after that, they basically they basically took bulldozers in and bulldozed a landfill. Okay, and so the house I grew up in, 1033 Cloverdale Street, was a shotgun house. Y'all know what shotgun houses are, right? We got that in common, right? And it was on the center blocks, and the driveway was dirt with broken glass. Okay, and the glass was so old that you could take it against your skin and it wouldn't do anything. It was the old brown and glass, the brown and green glass. You could play under the house. There were holes in the floorboard, and there were rats everywhere, but they couldn't get up into the house. And underneath the house, we'd find old syringes, we'd find inner tubes. I mean, we'd find old hubcaps. We find all kind of stuff to play with. And as kids, we didn't know, but that's what we played with. And it wasn't until later that we were told, why, some of my relatives began to get sick. Because we were, we walked the tracks. I talk about it in my book, where we would walk the tracks to Harold Latimer's store. And that was our thing for fun. We'd throw rocks at the train. Some of the best quarterbacks that came out of Newtown, they started by throwing rocks at the train. We had no idea about what, the environmental issues that were going on there. We were just playing. We didn't know.
Can I make a quick plug for people that don't know about Newtown? There is a book, because I had not heard of it. I didn't grow up in Gainesville. So that there is a book you can purchase that helps the Newtown Florist Club, and it gives the whole story. It's a great resource.
Yeah.
That's
and I know all those ladies. I know them personally. I know Rose. I knew Rose's mother. In fact, Rose's brother married one of my first cousins, and so that's how close this thing is. So, yeah. Another story that connects me with Gainesville. I was teaching disciple class, and you all remember the name Lois Kenyon, Judge Kenyon's wife? Sweetest, dearest lady that I knew. And she asked me the question one day. She says, Quincy, years ago, the junior league, I think it was called the Junior Service League at the time, got together and produced funds to create a kindergarten in the Green Hunter Homes. Atlanta Street is what we called it. Says, I wonder whatever happened to any of those kids. I says, Miss Kenyon, you looking at one. And what she didn't know is the lady that worked for her was my aunt, my mother's sister. And so again, there's these 6 degrees of separation that I found that I had in common with the people at Gainesville First Church. My daddy knew just about it. My daddy, some of y'all remember the name Jimmy Thompson. My daddy did all the concrete work for Jimmy Thompson. Again, there was these 6 degrees of separation from this church that I didn't know was there. All I knew was Gainesville First was the big white church, and my church was a little small black church. That's all I knew until I actually got there and formed relationships that went so deep that they influenced me today. And so, again, I think if we could find ways to have these conversations about what we have in common, I think we can begin to at least begin to acknowledge it. Now, let's keep in mind, we ain't gonna solve this problem overnight. We didn't get here overnight, and we're not gonna solve it overnight. But I do believe that we can begin to at least influence individuals and communities. I do believe that could happen through conversation, relationships.
Quincy, this is Latrell Simpson.
Yes.
I have a question. Why, and I don't know if it's interpreted as racism. I don't know what causes this, but why do you think we feel a need when we're describing someone, or that so often we say, this young black man or this young brown woman, but we don't say young white boy, young white girl? Is that a form of racism? Why do we feel the need to distinguish, as opposed, we talk about that we're all God's people. So why do we feel that we have to separate the people out by designating their color?
Latrell, that's an excellent question. And here's my legitimate answer. I don't know. I'm just being honest. I don't know. I wonder if it has something to do with the submerged beliefs. I don't know. Because typically when I describe people, I try to describe characteristics. Okay. This guy over here. Remember the first illustration I gave you about being at the gas station, about the guy with the gun? Did I mention what color he was?
I don't think.
Yeah. And so
I think you did.
no,
He did.
I never mentioned what color he was. Because in my mind, it didn't make a difference.
Yeah, but you know what? We all just assumed what color he was.
What color did you assume he was?
I assumed he was white.
You would be
Yeah.
wrong. He was black.
Well, see, there you go.
So you use that example right there, right?
Yeah.
If he would, why did you assume he was white? It's not a criticism, but what was the assumption? What was going on with the assumption that he was white?
So many people who are white have guns.
Okay. Now, just because so many people have guns, don't mean that this person had a gun.
Right.
You see how the submerged beliefs work?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The guy was black. But intentionally, I didn't use the descriptor because it didn't matter to me.
Right.
Okay.
Quincy,
Yes.
I think in answer to Latrell's question, I think that's a generational thing. My 13-year-old grandson was describing a friend of his as the boy with glasses.
Okay.
For me to identify him.
Okay.
And he was black, but he didn't say, the black boy in my class. He described him so I could identify him as the boy with glasses.
Okay.
I think it's our generation that does that. And I have hopes that my grandchildren won't do that.
Sure.
Right.
Sure. Well, that's
I had an experience with my daughter, Margaret Ellen, not too many years ago, actually. I told her, we were having a conversation, that I had met the loveliest black woman and we had enjoyed visiting. And she said, Mother, is it necessary for you to say that you met the nicest black woman? And I said, no. And she said, would you say you met the nicest white woman? And of course, I would not. And I consider myself enlightened racially, but I think you're right, Carol Ann, that it's the way that we have grown up, and we have all tried to have our children not do that, and we've made some progress.
Sure. Again, going back to Johnny Darden's earlier statement, a lot of this is influenced by the way that you grew up. Okay. And I tell people, when I grew up in a segregated community. My parents were products of segregation, but I was the beneficiary of desegregation. And I have learned I was indoctrinated and enculturated as a child to see the world through black eyes. It wasn't until I saw a larger world that I understood that the world is not just black and white. Okay. And so I don't see myself as a black man. I see myself as a man who happens to be black. But I also see myself as someone that looks more like my mother than anything else. Okay. And so I've had to learn. And so the stories that and the way that we brought up, as Johnny said, that's important. And so every day we're confronted with that. And so we have a choice. How do we deal with that? Some of the stories that I was taught, by just looking at the stuff I saw, I jumped to conclusions about. Okay. Listening to the sayings I heard, I jumped to conclusions about. It wasn't until much, much later that I was able to encounter and confront my own submerged beliefs. Oh, so this is what drives my behavior. And so what started at Gainesville First, continued at LaGrange. And I was at LaGrange for 17 years at the college. and at the church. Many people don't know that I was at the church, helped start their contemporary service. Loved every bit of it. Left there to felt God's call to start a church from scratch in a movie theater. Failed miserably at doing that, and then found myself as the executive pastor at Peachtree City, and was doing that fine. And then the bishop called. I'm like, okay, this is new. And so that's where I am today. But you know, part of my story, and part of all of our stories, is both individual, particular, and yet is contextual and global as well. And I think, for me at least, that's part of what Jesus is doing in the Good Samaritan story. If you recall, the Samaritan had the law on him, literally, and wanted to ask who was the neighbor to justify himself. And so Jesus tells the story. Yes.
Excuse me, we're going to have to stop for today. I think we could go on and go on.
All right.
We can't thank you enough. And I know everybody looks forward to next week.
Okay.
If there are specific questions members of the class might want you to address, if they could shoot me an email or a text with that, I can forward that on to you.
I'm happy to answer any questions.
Think of that, but we still have a long way to go down the road to Jericho. And so we will be with you next week. And again, thank you so much for your time, for your love of Gainesville, and hope you have a good week, and we'll be back with you next Sunday.
Take care.
Thank you.